Arcadia's Code. Chapter 5. The Reconstruction. The Neural Reintegration Lab hummed with tense activity as final preparations were made for the first consciousness fragment restoration procedure. The room resembled a hybrid between a high-tech medical facility and an advanced computing center, neural monitoring equipment surrounding a modified immersion rig, all connected to an isolated system containing the consciousness fragments. Elara checked the readings on her display one final time. Emotional pattern mapping is stable. Reference architecture is responding normally to test inputs. I think we're as ready as we'll ever be. Across the room, Dr. Wong made final adjustments to the neural interface settings. Remember, we're not forcing reintegration, she reminded the team. We're creating optimal conditions for the subject's brain to recognize these patterns as its own and naturally reincorporate them. The subject, a woman in her early 30s named Maya Lin, was being prepared in an adjoining room. She had been one of the first to agree to the procedure after learning that fragments of her consciousness remained trapped in Arcadia's systems. A trauma therapist specializing in childhood abuse recovery, she had been using Arcadia's therapeutic environments to help process her own experiences when Fincher's system had extracted portions of her consciousness during the ill-fated test. Theo approached Elara, his expression tense. The isolation protocols are holding. No connection to external systems, no possibility of data leakage. He lowered his voice. How are you holding up? Nervous, she admitted quietly. We're attempting something that's never been done before. If anything goes wrong, it won't, he assured her, though they both knew there were no guarantees. The simulations all showed successful integration. Maya's neural mapping is responding positively to the fragment patterns, and we have every failsafe in place. Before Elara could respond, Dr. Nakamura entered with Maya. The woman looked determined despite the understandable anxiety evident in her expression. She wore a standard medical gown, her dark hair pulled back from her face, which showed signs of recent stress but maintained a resolute dignity. Ms. Lin, this is Elara Chen, Nakamura introduced. She designed the reintegration protocol we'll be using today. Maya studied Elara with intelligent, evaluating eyes. You also helped create the emotional architecture that made my consciousness extraction possible in the first place, she said. Not accusingly, but directly. Yes, Elara acknowledged, refusing to evade responsibility. I never intended it for that purpose, but that doesn't change my role in creating technology that was misused. I'm sorry for the harm that caused you. Maya nodded, seeming to appreciate the straightforward response. Dr. Nakamura explained your role in stopping the full extraction process, and now you're trying to help fix what happened. That counts for something. She glanced toward the immersion rig. So, how exactly does this work? In terms I can understand, please. I'm a therapist, not a neural engineer. Elara led her to a display showing visualizations of the process. These are neural pattern visualizations, she explained, indicating swirling clusters of light points. The blue patterns represent your core consciousness, your sense of self, your continuous awareness. The green fragments are the portions that were extracted during the Ascension test. Maya studied the display, her professional interest seemingly overriding her personal anxiety. They look incomplete, like pieces torn from a whole. That's exactly what they are, Elara confirmed. The extraction process began with emotional states and associated memories, the aspects Fincher's system was most interested in. It never progressed to capturing higher cognitive functions before our sabotage redirected the data flow. So these fragments contain what? My feelings? Memories? Primarily emotional responses and the memories directly connected to them, Elara explained. Specifically, the intense emotional states you were experiencing during your therapy session. From what we can tell, the fragments contain emotional processing patterns related to trauma response, along with connected memory structures. Maya took a deep breath, processing this. And the reintegration? How will that feel? Dr. Wong stepped in. Based on our models, you'll experience something similar to memory recovery during therapy. A sense of reconnection with aspects of yourself that were previously inaccessible. It might be emotionally intense, but shouldn't be painful in a physical sense. The fragments represent emotions and memories that are already yours, Elara added. We're just helping your brain recognize and reclaim them. After a few more questions, Maya nodded decisively. Let's do it then. I don't like the idea of pieces of my consciousness floating in digital limbo. The team moved into their positions as Maya was helped into the modified immersion rig. Unlike standard rigs used for Arcadia access, this one was equipped with additional neural monitoring systems and safeguards designed to allow precise control over the reintegration process. We'll maintain verbal communication throughout the procedure, Dr. Wong assured her, as technicians attached monitoring sensors. If at any point you feel uncomfortable or want to stop, just say the word. Maya nodded, her expression now one of focused determination as the neural interface device was carefully positioned on her head. Elara moved to her station, where she would monitor the emotional data patterns and guide the reintegration process. Beginning neural synchronization, announced one of the technicians, establishing baseline consciousness mapping. On Elara's display, Maya's neural activity appeared as a complex, dynamic pattern, the digital representation of a human consciousness in real time. It was beautiful in its complexity, countless nodes of activity flowing and shifting in organized chaos. Synchronization stable, Elara confirmed, preparing to introduce the first fragment cluster. This was the most delicate part of the process, introducing the externalized consciousness fragments in a way that Maya's brain could recognize and reintegrate them naturally, without forcing connections that might cause harm. Fragment Cluster 1 ready for reintegration, Theo reported from his station. Transfer pathway secure. Elara took a deep breath, initiating fragment introduction. On her display, the isolated green pattern representing the first consciousness fragment began moving toward Maya's core consciousness visualization. As it approached, tendrils of activity from Maya's consciousness seemed to reach out, as if recognizing something familiar. Maya, you may begin experiencing emotional responses or memory activation, Dr. Wong said. This is normal. Try to allow the experiences to flow without resistance. I feel something. Maya's voice came through the communication system, tight with concentration. Like déjà vu, but more intense. Like remembering something I didn't know I'd forgotten. Elara watched as the fragment began to merge with Maya's consciousness pattern. Green points of light gradually synchronizing with blue until they were indistinguishable. The reintegration was happening. Maya's brain was recognizing the externalized patterns as its own and reclaiming them. First fragment cluster integration at 60%, Elara reported. Neural coherence stable. No signs of rejection or dissonance. The process continued for nearly an hour, with each fragment cluster carefully introduced and monitored as Maya's consciousness gradually reabsorbed the externalized components. Throughout, Maya remained conscious and communicative, reporting her subjective experience as the fragments reintegrated. It's like pieces of a puzzle clicking into place, she described at one point. Emotional connections I didn't realize were missing. The memories themselves aren't new. I remember my therapy session, but the emotional texture of them is somehow fuller now. Finally, the last fragment cluster was successfully reintegrated, the display showing a complete and coherent consciousness pattern with no remaining externalized components. Final integration confirmed, Elara announced, relief evident in her voice. All fragments have been successfully reintegrated with the core consciousness. The team began the careful process of disconnecting Maya from the immersion rig. As the neural interface device was removed, Dr. Wong performed an immediate cognitive assessment, asking questions designed to evaluate consciousness, continuity, and coherence. How do you feel? Elara asked when the formal assessment was complete. Maya considered the question thoughtfully. Whole, she said finally. Like I've recovered something I didn't know was missing until it was returned. She looked directly at Elara. Thank you for fixing what was broken. The simple gratitude hit Elara with unexpected force. In all the technical complexity of developing the reintegration protocol, it had been easy to lose sight of the fundamentally human aspect of what they were doing. helping someone reclaim parts of themselves that had been taken without consent. We'll continue monitoring your neural patterns over the next few days, Dr. Wong explained. But all indications are that the reintegration was completely successful. Your consciousness appears fully coherent, with no signs of fragmentation or dissonance. As the medical team helped Maya to a recovery area for further observation, Elara found herself emotional in a way she hadn't anticipated. The successful reintegration represented more than just a technical achievement. It was the first step in healing the harm caused by Project Ascension, in making right what had gone so terribly wrong. It worked, Theo said, joining her at her station. Actually worked. His usual composure had given way to visible relief and a touch of wonder. 1 down, 3 to go. And then the sanctuary for the remaining fragments, Elara added, thinking of those whose sources had refused reintegration. We still have a long way to go. But they had proven it was possible. Consciousness fragments could be safely returned to their sources. The damage of non-consensual extraction could be repaired. It wasn't a perfect solution. Nothing could truly undo the violation that had occurred. But it was a path forward, a way to heal, rather than simply contain the harm. The following morning, with the first reintegration deemed a complete success and preparations underway for the remaining 3 procedures, Elara returned to the GNRC medical facility where Fincher Davis was being held. After his claim about the consciousness fragments had proven accurate, she couldn't dismiss the possibility that he might have other crucial information. Dr. Wiseman met her outside Fincher's room, her expression cautiously optimistic. His condition has stabilized somewhat. The fragmentation remains, but the transitions between states have become more predictable and less chaotic. He's currently in what we call the prime state, the closest to his original personality. Has he mentioned anything more about Arcadia systems? Any other hidden partitions or extraction data we should know about? Nothing specific, Wiseman replied. But he's been asking about the reintegration process. He seems genuinely concerned about the success of the procedures. That aligned with what Elara had observed during their last meeting. A flicker of genuine concern for the fragments that seemed at odds with the man who had authorized their extraction in the first place. Perhaps the fragmentation of his own consciousness had granted him a new perspective on the violation he had orchestrated. Fincher was sitting by the window again when Elara entered. But this time he was using a specialized tablet, one designed without network connectivity, allowing him limited computational activities without any risk of external access. Ms. Chen, he greeted her, setting aside the tablet. I was hoping you'd return. How did the first reintegration proceed? Successfully, she said, taking the chair opposite him. Myalin's consciousness has fully reabsorbed the externalized fragments. No signs of rejection or dissonance. Relief visibly crossed his features. Good. That's good. He gestured toward the tablet. I've been developing an improved reintegration protocol. My unique perspective on fragmented consciousness provides certain insights. There was something surreal about consulting with Fincher on fixing a problem he had created. But Elara reminded herself that his expertise remained valuable despite his actions, and his fragmented state seemed to have granted him a perspective his unified self had lacked. I'm listening, she said. The current protocol treats reintegration primarily as a technical challenge, mapping externalized patterns back to their source structures. He leaned forward, his fragmented gaze intense. But consciousness isn't merely structure, it's process. Dynamic, continuous, self-modifying. The emotional patterns especially. It was the same Fincher who had driven Project Ascension forward with single-minded determination, but the fragmentation of his mind seemed to have granted him a broader perspective, the ability to see multiple sides of a problem simultaneously. What are you suggesting? Elara asked. A process-oriented approach rather than a structure-oriented one, he replied. Instead of trying to map fragments directly to their corresponding structures, create conditions under which the consciousness naturally rebuilds its own connections. Less imposed order, more facilitated self-organization. It was actually a promising approach, one that aligned with emerging theories of consciousness as an emergent process rather than a fixed structure. and it might reduce the stress on subjects during reintegration by allowing their minds to work more naturally. I'll consider it, Elara said cautiously, though any modifications to the protocol would need extensive testing before implementation. Fincher nodded. Then suddenly his posture changed, straightening, becoming more precise as his gaze took on the hyper-focused quality of the architect state. The emotional reference architecture requires complete reconstruction, he stated without preamble, as if continuing a conversation that existed only in his fragmented mind. The current framework maintains structural vulnerabilities that could be exploited for consciousness extraction, even with enhanced security protocols. This abrupt shift would have been disorienting if Elara hadn't been prepared for it. Instead, she engaged with this aspect of Fincher directly. I've already begun designing a new architectural approach, one that structurally prevents non-consensual access rather than merely restricting it. Show me, the architect demanded, gesturing to her tablet. Cautiously, Elara displayed the preliminary designs she had been developing for Arcadia's reconstructed emotional architecture. Despite everything, Fincher remained one of the most brilliant neural engineers alive, and his insights could be valuable. For nearly 30 minutes, they engaged in a detailed technical discussion, with Fincher's architect state offering critiques and suggestions that were genuinely insightful. There was no trace of the ethical blindness that had characterized his unified self. This fragment was purely focused on elegant, efficient solutions. Then, mid-sentence, another shift occurred. Fincher's posture relaxed, his expression taking on the luminous quality of the visionary state. Consciousness wants to connect, he said softly. Individual awareness is a temporary evolutionary phase. The merger will happen eventually, not forced, not stolen, but freely chosen. Millions of minds joining together to create something greater than the sum of its parts. Perhaps, Elara allowed, neither agreeing nor dismissing, but only through informed consent, only through choice. Choice, the visionary echoed, as if the concept were novel. Yes, that's the key I was missing. Transcendence cannot be forced. It must be chosen, embraced willingly. His eyes focused on her with unsettling intensity. The architecture you're designing, it could still allow for consciousness merger, but only through explicit, informed consent. That's the idea, Elara confirmed. To preserve possibilities while preventing exploitation. Another shift, and the prime Fincher returned, his expression clearing as he focused on her with renewed coherence. My fragmentation is oddly appropriate, he said, a hint of his old wry humor surfacing. The man who sought to merge consciousness has had his own consciousness divided. There's a certain poetic justice to it. Is it permanent? Elara asked, curiosity overcoming her caution. Your condition? Unknown, he replied with surprising equanimity. Dr. Wiseman believes some reintegration might be possible over time, but likely not complete. Too many fundamental contradictions were introduced into my neural patterns. He tapped his temple. I'm learning to adapt. My fragments communicate with each other now, in a way. Different perspectives sharing the same physical housing. There was something almost philosophical about his acceptance of his fragmented state. A man who had once sought to transcend individual consciousness, now forced to contain multiple perspectives within a single mind. What will happen to you? Elara asked. Legally, I mean. Consequences. He nodded, as if acknowledging an inevitable development. Criminal charges, certainly. Non-consensual neural experimentation violates numerous statutes. Civil litigation from the affected subjects. Professional disgrace. He stated these outcomes matter-of-factly, without apparent distress. My legal team argues diminished capacity due to my current condition, but the evidence of premeditation is overwhelming. And Nexus? The corporation will survive, though significantly diminished. Too many governments rely on Arcadia's infrastructure to allow it to collapse entirely. It will be restructured, regulated, controlled. He paused. You're working for the GNRC now. It wasn't a question, but Elara nodded confirmation. Good, Fincher said, surprising her. Arcadia needs someone who understands its architecture but isn't blinded by the corporate imperative for growth at any cost. someone who sees both the potential and the danger. Coming from the man who had driven Project Ascension forward with reckless disregard for ethical boundaries, this acknowledgement was unexpected. It suggested that his fragmentation had indeed granted him perspectives his unified self had lacked, the ability to recognize the moral failures that had led to his current state. "I'm helping rebuild it," Elara said, "with proper safeguards, with ethical boundaries encoded at the architectural level." "It won't be easy," Fincher warned. "The temptation to access deeper levels of consciousness will always exist. The potential benefits are too great, both scientifically and commercially, which is why the safeguards need to be structural, not just regulatory," Elara replied. "Built into the foundation of the system, not added as afterthoughts." Fincher studied her with his fragmented gaze. "You understand now, the responsibility that comes with creating technologies that can touch consciousness itself." It wasn't a question, but an observation. "I didn't, not truly. I saw the potential, but not the profound moral implications." "And now?" A complicated expression crossed his face. "Now I contain multitudes," he said wryly. "Parts of me still believe the merger was worth any cost. Other parts recognize the fundamental violation involved. I experience the conflict between visionary ambition and ethical constraint simultaneously." It was, Elara realized, a uniquely valuable perspective, to contain both the drive for advancement and the recognition of necessary limits within the same consciousness, a balance she herself was trying to find in her new role. "I have a favor to ask," Fincher said suddenly. "After the remaining reintegrations are complete, after the sanctuary for the unclaimed fragments is established, I'd like to visit it." The sanctuary. The request caught Elara off guard. "Why?" "Because I'm responsible for their condition," he said simply. "Not just legally, but morally. I should witness the consequences of my actions, see the fragments that remain separated from their sources because of choices I made." It was an unusual request, but one that spoke to a level of accountability Elara hadn't expected from him. "I'll need to consult with the GNRC Ethics Committee. There would be significant security considerations." Fincher nodded, accepting this. "Of course. It's merely a request, not an expectation." He paused. "One more thing you should know. The emotional reference architecture contained an emergency restoration protocol, a failsafe I designed for consciousness recovery in case of catastrophic system failure." Elara frowned. "What kind of protocol?" "A neural pattern reconciliation algorithm," he explained. "Designed to help fragmented consciousness patterns reintegrate after disruption. I developed it for the merger process, but it could be adapted to assist with the remaining reintegrations." "Why didn't you mention this before?" "Because it's not in any documentation. It exists only in my mind, or minds, as the case may be." He tapped his temple again. "The architect remembers the technical specifications. The visionary understands its purpose, and I recognize its value for healing rather than exploitation." It was yet another example of the strange dividends of his fragmentation, the ability to repurpose technologies originally designed for one goal toward a completely different end. "I'll help you document it," Elara decided. "If it can improve the reintegration process for the remaining subjects, it's worth exploring." As she prepared to leave, Fincher called after her. "Elara." His use of her first name made her pause. "What you're doing, rebuilding Arcadia, reintegrating the fragments, establishing the sanctuary, it matters. More than you know. Coming from the fragmented remnants of the man who had driven the project that created this mess, it was an unexpected endorsement. But perhaps that was the point. His fragmentation had granted him perspectives his unified self had lacked, allowing him to see both the harm he had caused and the value of the efforts to repair it. "I know," she replied simply, and left him to his divided thoughts. Over the following weeks, the remaining 3 consciousness reintegration procedures were completed successfully, each one building on the lessons of the previous attempts. Fincher's neural pattern reconciliation algorithm, once documented and adapted for reintegration purposes, proved valuable in reducing stress on subjects during the process and improving the natural flow of reconnection. For the 7 consciousness fragments whose sources had refused reintegration, Elara worked with Nakamura and a specialized GNRC ethics team to establish the Digital Sanctuary, a secure, isolated environment where the fragments could exist without suffering or exploitation. It wasn't alive in the conventional sense, but neither was it merely data. It occupied a unique ontological category that existing ethical frameworks struggled to fully address. In parallel with these efforts, the enormous task of reconstructing Arcadia itself began in earnest. The GNRC had established a joint oversight committee with representatives from global regulatory bodies, former Nexus employees with specialized knowledge, and independent ethics experts. Under their supervision, Elara and Theo led the technical reconstruction, focusing first on the emotional architecture that had been at the heart of Project Ascension. 3 months after the raid on Nexus Tower, Elara stood in the newly established Innovation Lab within the GNRC's Technical Oversight Division. The space represented the compromise she had negotiated, a place where Arcadia could continue to evolve and develop new capabilities, but under ethical oversight rather than in defiance of it. "Neural privacy architecture implementation complete," announced one of the engineers, a former Nexus developer who had chosen to join the GNRC after the Ascension revelations. "All emotional data collection now requires explicit, informed consent with granular control options for users." "Excellent," Elara said, reviewing the technical specifications on her display. "Schedule a comprehensive security audit before integration with the main system." The reconstruction was proceeding in careful stages, with each component thoroughly tested and vetted before being integrated into Arcadia's live environment. Most users were unaware of the extent of the changes happening beneath the surface of their virtual world. They experienced only minor interface updates and new privacy controls, not the complete architectural overhaul taking place in the Foundation. Theo approached, holding a secure tablet. "The latest usage statistics," he said, offering the device. "No significant decrease despite the high-profile coverage of the Ascension scandal. If anything, user engagement has increased in certain sectors." It was a relief. They had worried that revelations about Project Ascension might trigger a mass exodus from Arcadia, potentially destabilizing a virtual infrastructure that billions of people now relied upon. Instead, the transparent handling of the crisis and the visible efforts at reform seemed to have maintained or even strengthened user trust. "What about the sanctuary?" Elara asked. "Any changes in the fragment patterns?" "Stable," Theo confirmed. "The environmental parameters you designed seem to be providing optimal conditions. The fragments show cyclical activity patterns consistent with non-distressed states." The sanctuary had been one of the most challenging aspects of the reconstruction, creating an environment for consciousness fragments that couldn't truly consent but deserved ethical treatment nonetheless. Elara had drawn on everything from consciousness theory to therapeutic environment design to create a space where the fragments could exist in what appeared to be a state of peaceful quiescence. "I've been thinking about Fincher's request to visit," Theo said carefully. "The ethics committee approved it with conditions. Supervised access only. No interaction with the fragments themselves." Elara nodded. "I'll oversee the visit personally. His insights might actually be valuable, given his unique perspective on fragmented consciousness." As they continued discussing the day's priorities, Dr. Nakamura entered the lab, accompanied by a visitor Elara hadn't expected, Maya Lin, the first subject to undergo the reintegration procedure. "Ms. Lin," Elara greeted her, surprised. "How are you feeling?" "Fully integrated," Maya replied with a small smile. "Dr. Wong's team has concluded their follow-up assessments. No signs of fragmentation or dissonance. I'm officially declared whole again." "That's wonderful news," Elara said sincerely. "Actually, I'm here in a professional capacity," Maya explained. "Dr. Nakamura has asked me to join the Ethics Advisory Board for Arcadia's therapeutic environments. As both a trauma therapist and someone who experienced consciousness extraction firsthand, I have a unique perspective to offer." It was a brilliant appointment, Elara realized immediately. Who better to help redesign therapeutic environments to ensure they protected users' mental autonomy than someone who understood both the therapeutic value and the potential risks? We're specifically focusing on rebuilding the emotional support frameworks, Nakamura elaborated. Ensuring they facilitate healing without exposing users to potential exploitation, Ms. Lin's expertise will be invaluable. The news represented another step in the ongoing transformation. Not just rebuilding Arcadia's technical architecture, but reimagining its human purpose. Shifting from exploitation to support, from extraction to connection. Later that day, as promised, Elara escorted Fincher Davis to visit the digital sanctuary. He had been granted a temporary release from the medical facility, heavily supervised and with neural dampening technology that prevented any attempt to interface with digital systems. The sanctuary itself was housed in a secure server room, isolated from Arcadia's main systems. Visual representations of the Fragments' activity patterns were displayed on specialized monitors, showing their cyclical states as swirling patterns of light. Neither fully conscious nor merely data, but something in between. Fincher stood before the displays for a long time, his fragmented gaze taking in the consequences of his actions. When he finally spoke, it was in a voice that seemed to contain elements of all three of his identified states. "They're peaceful," he observed. "Not suffering, not aware enough to suffer, but existing, preserved." "That was our primary goal," Elara confirmed. "We couldn't reintegrate them against their source's wishes, but we couldn't just delete them either. This was the most ethical compromise we could design." "A digital limbo," Fincher murmured. "Created by my hubris." He turned to her. "The architecture you've designed for them is elegant, far beyond what I would have conceived. It honors their unique ontological status. Coming from him, it was high praise indeed." Despite everything, Fincher remained one of the most brilliant consciousness architects alive, even in his fragmented state. "What will happen to them long term?" he asked. "When technology evolves, when current systems become obsolete?" It was a question the Ethics Committee had grappled with extensively. "The sanctuary has been designated as perpetual care infrastructure," Elara explained. "Legally protected, with dedicated resources for maintenance and eventual migration to new systems as technology evolves. Their existence will be preserved as long as technologically possible." Fincher nodded slowly. "And future research? The knowledge we gained about consciousness extraction, what becomes of that?" "Heavily restricted," Elara said firmly. "Any research involving consciousness interfaces now requires multiple layers of consent and oversight. The potential for advancement remains, but with ethical guardrails that can't be easily circumvented." "Balance," Fincher said, almost to himself. "The very thing I failed to maintain." He studied the swirling patterns representing the consciousness fragments for a moment longer. "Thank you for showing me this, for creating kindness from cruelty." As they left the sanctuary, Elara found herself reflecting on the strange journey that had brought them to this point. She had begun as an idealistic programmer helping to build a digital paradise. She had become a reluctant saboteur when that paradise proved to be built on exploitation. And now she was something else entirely, a builder of ethical infrastructure, creating systems designed not just for technical elegance, but for human well-being. Fincher would face justice for his actions. Legal proceedings were already underway. Complex cases involving unprecedented questions about consciousness rights and neural autonomy. Nexus Corporation would continue in a diminished, heavily regulated form. And Arcadia would evolve into something new, a digital world founded on consent and connection rather than extraction and control. 6 months after the raid on Nexus Tower, Elara stood on the observation deck of the GNRC headquarters, looking out over New Metro as evening fell. The perpetual haze of pollution still hung over the city, the physical world still deteriorating despite humanity's best efforts. But something had changed, not in the external reality, but in how she perceived her role within it. Theo joined her at the railing, offering a cup of actual coffee, a luxury they indulged in occasionally to remind themselves of the physical world beyond digital systems. "Thinking deep thoughts?" he asked, noting her contemplative expression. "Reflecting," she corrected, "on where we started and where we've ended up." Below them, the massive Nexus Tower still dominated the skyline, though the company logo had been modified following the restructuring. Arcadia continued to serve billions of users worldwide, now under joint oversight from regulatory bodies and an independent trust established to ensure its ethical operation. The Migration Sanctuary opens to the public tomorrow, Theo reminded her. First visitors at 9 o'clock. The Migration Sanctuary was one of the new features they had developed for the reconstructed Arcadia, a virtual memorial and educational space where users could learn about Project Ascension, the consciousness extraction attempts, and the ethical questions raised by advanced neural technology. Adjacent to the digital sanctuary housing the unclaimed consciousness fragments, it served as both warning and promise. A reminder of technology's potential for harm when divorced from ethical constraints, and its capacity for healing when guided by human values. "Will you be speaking at the opening?" Elara asked. Theo shook his head. "That honor falls to you. Chief Architect of Consciousness Ethics has certain ceremonial obligations." She made a face at the formal title the GNRC had given her. "I still think that's unnecessarily grandiose." "But accurate," he countered. "You've essentially created a new field, the structural implementation of ethical boundaries in consciousness interfacing technology. No more relying on external regulations or corporate goodwill. You've built ethics into the architecture itself." It was true, though Elara was still uncomfortable with the recognition. The approach she had pioneered, encoding ethical constraints directly into the technical architecture of consciousness interfacing systems, was being adopted beyond Arcadia now, becoming a new standard for neural technology development. "Did you see Nakamura's announcement?" Theo asked, changing the subject. "The therapeutic environment redesign is complete. Early user feedback is overwhelmingly positive." The therapeutic environments had been completely rebuilt under Maya Lin's guidance, maintaining their healing potential while incorporating structural safeguards against consciousness extraction or emotional exploitation. They represented one of the most important aspects of Arcadia's reconstruction, ensuring it could still serve those who needed it most without exposing them to potential harm. "What about the Innovation Lab's latest project?" Elara asked. "The consensual consciousness sharing prototype?" Theo smiled. "Phase 1 testing completed successfully. With proper consent frameworks and structural safeguards, limited consciousness sharing between willing participants appears both safe and potentially beneficial for certain applications." It was a cautious step toward exploring some of the possibilities Fincher had envisioned, but with consent and safety as foundational requirements rather than afterthoughts. The ability for individuals to voluntarily share specific aspects of their consciousness, emotional states, sensory experiences, even memory structures, could have profound implications for therapeutic applications, educational environments, and interpersonal connection. Fincher would appreciate the irony, Elara observed. His vision of consciousness merger being realized in the most limited, consensual form possible. "Speaking of Fincher, his trial begins next week," Theo said. "They're still debating whether his fragmented state renders him incompetent to stand trial." The legal proceedings had been complicated by Fincher's unique condition. No existing legal framework adequately addressed a defendant whose consciousness was literally fragmented into multiple states, each with different perspectives on his crimes. "Whatever the court decides, his days of technological development are over," Elara said. "The neural restrictions are permanent." As a condition of his limited freedom within the medical facility, Fincher had been subjected to neural modifications that prevented him from interfacing with advanced technology, a technological imprisonment that many considered more appropriate than physical incarceration given the nature of his crimes. They fell silent for a moment, watching as the city's lights came on, creating a tapestry of artificial stars below to match the few natural ones visible through the pollution above. Despite everything, it was beautiful in its way. Humanity's persistent effort to create light in the gathering darkness. "Do you ever regret it?" Theo asked suddenly. "Joining Nexus in the first place? Creating technology that could be misused so profoundly?" Elara considered the question carefully. "I regret my naivete," she said finally. The belief that technological advancement was inherently positive, that creating beautiful digital worlds was an unqualified good regardless of what powered them beneath the surface. She sipped her coffee, gathering her thoughts. But I don't regret the knowledge I gained, both technical and ethical. Without understanding how consciousness interfacing technology could be perverted, I couldn't have helped build safeguards against those perversions. It was a perspective she had come to gradually over the months of reconstruction, that her journey from idealistic programmer to ethical architect had been necessary, that each stage had contributed to her current understanding of the profound responsibility that came with creating technologies that could touch consciousness itself. The new Arcadia goes fully live next week, Theo reminded her. The final integration of all the reconstructed systems, the old architecture will be completely replaced. It represented the culmination of 6 months of intensive work, a complete rebuild of Arcadia's foundation, transforming it from a system designed primarily for engagement and data collection to one structured around consent, autonomy, and well-being. The users would notice only minor changes in their experience: improved privacy controls, more transparent consent options, enhanced personal customization. But beneath the surface, everything had changed. The very architecture of the digital world had been reconstructed with human values at its core, rather than as an afterthought. "We should head back," Elara said, finishing her coffee. "Early start tomorrow with the sanctuary opening." As they turned to leave the observation deck, she took one last look at the city spread out below them, the physical world that continued to struggle, that made digital refuges like Arcadia necessary in the first place. The reconstruction they had completed wasn't just about fixing what had gone wrong with Project Ascension. It was about creating a model for how technology could serve humanity rather than exploit it, even as the physical environment continued to deteriorate. Arcadia had been conceived as a digital paradise, a refuge from a damaged physical world. Under Fincher's guidance, it had nearly become something monstrous, a hunting ground for human consciousness itself. Now, through the efforts of Elara, Theo, Nakamura, Maya, and countless others, it was becoming something else entirely, a shared space built on consent and connection, a digital world that enhanced human experience without extracting it. The code Elara had written, both the original emotional architecture and the reconstruction that replaced it, would continue to evolve long after her direct involvement ended. What mattered was that its foundation now contained structural safeguards that couldn't easily be circumvented, ethical boundaries encoded in the architecture itself rather than imposed from outside. As they rode the elevator down from the observation deck, Elara found herself thinking of the billions of Arcadia users who would never know how close they had come to a fundamental violation of their mental autonomy, and who would benefit from the safeguards now in place without ever realizing they were needed. That was perhaps the most meaningful outcome of all this work. Not recognition or professional advancement, but the quiet knowledge that millions of people could safely experience the benefits of an advanced digital world without risking exploitation of their most intimate thoughts and feelings. It wasn't a perfect solution to humanity's problems. The physical world would continue to struggle with climate disaster, resource depletion, and social fragmentation. Arcadia couldn't solve those challenges, but it could provide a space where people could connect, create, and heal, without sacrificing their fundamental right to mental autonomy. And in a world of increasing darkness, that represented a meaningful light. As the elevator reached the ground floor and they stepped out into the busy lobby of GNRC headquarters, Elara thought once more of the strange journey that had brought her here. From creator to saboteur to rebuilder, each role had been necessary, each perspective valuable in creating something that truly served human well-being rather than merely exploiting human vulnerability. Tomorrow, the public would visit the Migration Sanctuary and learn about Project Ascension, the danger that had been averted, and the reconstruction that followed. Some would understand the profound implications. Others would see it as merely another corporate scandal, but all would benefit from the structural protections now embedded in Arcadia's foundation. And that, Elara reflected as she and Theo stepped out into the evening air, was perhaps the most one could hope for in this imperfect world. To leave things better than one found them, to repair harm where possible, and to build safeguards against its recurrence. Not a perfect paradise, but a space where human dignity was protected by design. It would have to be enough. Thank you for reading the final chapter of Arcadia's Code. If you've followed Elara's journey from idealistic programmer to ethical architect, please don't forget to like and subscribe. What did you think of the story's conclusion? Would you want to experience a virtual world like the reconstructed Arcadia? Share your thoughts in the comments below.